This week on the Steel Report.
And if that voter is honest when you're doing the survey, then you have a pretty good poll result. But if you can't do that, then that makes polling really challenging.
KWWL political analyst Dr. Chris Larimer of UNI gives us his pre-election observations. Plus,
each install takes about an hour and 15 minutes, and it's just a great time to get the flagpole installed, get to know the veteran really well, and hear their story.
The Veteran Flagpole Initiative on a new mission to give flagpoles and flags to Iowa veterans. And our program begins right now.
Now from KWWL, this is the Steel Report.
And welcome to this week's edition of the Steel Report, just ahead of the big election on Tuesday. In just a couple of minutes, you're going to hear from KWWL political analyst Dr. Chris Larimer of the University of Northern Iowa, as Chris will give us some of his last-minute observations. But first of all, on today's program, I want to bring you an update on a great nonprofit based in Waverly called the Veteran Flagpole Initiative.
So it started with a group of friends, many of which were veterans, but not all of our members were veterans. And we had gathered and we wanted to do something good for our communities. We realized that we all have a sense of purpose in wanting to offer what we can to our citizens. And we arrived on this idea that we just tried one time, which was to install one flagpole for a veteran. We paid for everything, we dug the hole, and right when we were done with it, we realized that we had kind of inadvertently stumbled across something pretty special. The impact that it had on the group of volunteers, the group that it had on the veteran, and it was a bond that just lasted for, forever. So we said, why not just package this up and do it all across the state? And that's what we've been doing for the past 2.5 years, is identifying veterans, identifying different sources of funding, and then installing these flagpoles all over Iowa. I mean, eventually what we hope to do in the next 3 years is to have a flagpole installed in each of Iowa's 99 counties, and we're on track to do that now. Over the past 2.5 years, we've installed a total of 82 flagpoles. So part of the installation is they get an American-made 20-foot telescopic pole. That's a very easy pole, durable pole. It's easy for the veterans who are maybe a little bit older to raise that up, bring it down to half mast, or even just take the pole out during inclement weather. Everything American made. We put everything in with Quikrete, obviously, and we use rock on top of that. These are the solar powered lights, so every kit has a solar powered light so that the flag is visible at all hours of the day for proper flag etiquette and displaying procedures. The hand-stitched U.S. flag, and right below that we fly an Iowa flag. So by the time it's done, they have a 20-foot telescopic pole. They have a solar-powered light that shines on a hand-stitched U.S. flag and an Iowa flag, and it's just a beautiful setup. It's a very authentic look, and it's one that the veterans who receive it are extremely happy and proud to display. We are sourced completely out of donations from fellow Iowans and actually all across the country. We procure our flagpoles from Martin's Flag Supply in Des Moines, and they've been an amazing partner. We want to make sure that everything we do is American-made. That's really important with us. So we get our flagpoles from Martin Flagpole Supply, and then we use Allegiant flags, which are hand-stitched flags made right here in the United States. For our consumables, which are like our rock and our concrete and the sonotubes that we use, we get those from Lowe's, and we purchase those regionally. Donations are critical to what we do. Without donations, we would dry up. Everything that we do goes directly back into the effort. We're a 100% volunteer-based organization. We've got approximately 80 volunteers all across the state, so every dollar that comes to us directly goes back into flagpoles all across Iowa. To celebrate Veterans Day, what we've done is we've done a combined effort, and we've identified Keokuk County down in southeast Iowa, and we're going to place one flagpole in every single town within that county for a total of 18 flagpole installations. So one veteran per town within that county, all happening on Saturday. So we have a total of 6 teams. Each team will probably have about 7 to 9 volunteers on there. Each install takes about an hour and 15 minutes, and it's just a great time to get the flagpole installed, get to know the veteran really well, and hear their story. So our big focus is to mobilize Iowans, whether that's past veterans or Iowa citizens who are just looking for a purpose. What we want to do is have them arrive and join our team and spend just an hour every weekend and help install these flagpoles. There's jobs and skills available for all ages, all physical abilities, And it just takes an hour out of your weekend, and it leaves these veterans with a permanent reminder that we still appreciate and we will always appreciate what they do. I think in Iowa that if you do things ethically and you do it the right way, that the grassroots movement will follow. So what we find is we go in and we do an install in an area, and we kind of build up some support in that area, whether that's more volunteers or more money. And really what we want to do ultimately is, have days where we're serving all 99 counties in one day. And I think that we can get to that point. It's just awareness and people understanding that this effort exists. And, we've got a team ready to support any effort along those lines that we need. Just recently, I retired from the Iowa National Guard. I spent 24 years there. I was a staff sergeant, and then obtained my commission and eventually retired as a major, as a company commander within the organization. But a couple deployments in 24 years and serving with people that were far greater than me, who inspired me through the whole time that I was in the service. And I look at those people as giants of which I stood on their shoulders, and I just want to pay back all those veterans. I still admire and look up to these veterans so much, and I want them to know that people care deeply about what they did and every sacrifice that they gave for this country. Our long-term goal is what we're looking to do is build a RAGBRAI team that we would follow the RAGBRAI route with the masses, but along the way we would install 2 to 3 flagpoles for veterans each day of the route. So we're looking at a total of maybe 15 to 20 flagpole installations throughout the duration of RAGBRAI, and just trying to find a support staff and patriotic riders and people who would be willing to join our team and build that. But it's something we feel like we can accomplish.
And as always, thanks to Eric for telling us all about his organization known as the Veteran Flagpole Initiative. They can always use a donation and, of course, volunteers as well. Coming up next, it's almost Election Day. We're going to hear directly from KWWL political analyst Dr. Chris Larimer of UNI. That's coming up. And welcome back to this week's edition of the Steele Report. As you can see, KWWL political analyst Dr. Chris Larimer of the University of Northern Iowa is my guest today with some of his final observations with, can you believe it, Chris, Election Day is upon us. And yes. I think the thing that I've been most impressed by or kind of stunned by is the number of people who have voted early. You said you voted on the first day up at UNI.
Yeah, I did. I took advantage of the satellite voting up there. It's very easy to get it done very quickly. But you're right. We're, as of Thursday, it's almost 60 million people in the United States have voted. In Iowa, creeping up on the 500,000 mark, wow. which is notable. If you look back at 2012 and 2016, over 600,000 Iowans cast their ballot early or absentee. And we're creeping up on that 500,000 mark. I don't know if we'll get to the 2016 or 2012 mark, but yeah, for a lot of Iowans, for a lot of Americans, in a way, the election is over in the sense that they've already cast their ballot.
Yeah, they know how they voted. We don't know how anybody else is going to vote. I'm usually an election day voter. I still, at this point, haven't made up my mind whether to vote earlier or not. I really haven't. So this election is presidential focused, obviously, with a lot of down ballot considerations. What has kind of stood out about this particular race for president as divisive and as loud as it has been?
Obviously with the change at the top of the ticket for the Democratic Party, where you go from President Biden to Vice President Harris, that really, a lot of people say that shook up the race. But then really since then, you look at the polling and it's been pretty stable over the last two months or so, where you haven't seen a lot of movement. And that it's down to 7, really what seems to be 7 battleground states. And within those battleground states, you don't see a lot of movement. So there's all this attention on those 7 states, but we really haven't seen a lot of movement in the polls over the last several weeks. And so I think the fact that we're still at that point where it's really up in the air, nobody really knows what's going to happen, and all the attention is on those 7. What people are looking at when it comes to Iowa is there going to be a swing, right? We've seen swings in the past in Iowa, whether going all the way back to 1984 to 1988, or 2000 to 2004, or in 2012 to 2016. There have been double-digit cross-partisan swings where it's gone Democrat to Republican or Republican to Democrat. I think in Iowa the question is it going to be a closer race, than what we saw in 2016 or 2020, where you had the Republican candidate Donald Trump winning by 8-9 percentage points? Does that come down a little bit? The last Iowa poll had that race within 4 points, compared to earlier in the summer it was up to 18 points. So if it's closer this time around, does that put us back in that battleground status you know, for the 2028 election. I think, you know, the other thing with the 7 battleground states this cycle, it seems to be a lot of attention on Pennsylvania, and, you know, an expectation of if Pennsylvania goes a particular way, then do Wisconsin and Michigan also go the same way, given the demographics of those 3 states? And if that's the case, the candidate that wins those 3 may have an edge to win it.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the overall race, I mean, it's very, very tight. And Chris, for these polling operators, that last poll just before the election is really important.
It absolutely is. And, you know, pollsters are coming off essentially 3 election cycles, if you count 2016, 2020, and then even the midterm in 2022, where there have been issues about getting that, who is going to be a likely voter correct, right? So they get that final prediction accurate, because, you know, they underestimated Trump support in 2016 and 2020. They underestimated Democratic support in 2022. So I think the question for this cycle is, have they made enough corrections over those 3 cycles to be closer to what the actual electorate is? I mean, that's the challenge for every pollster, is you try to identify who is a, quote, likely voter. In other words, someone who's going to show up on election day or vote early. And if that voter is honest when you're doing the survey, then you have a pretty good poll result. But if you can't do that, then that makes polling really challenging. And so I think that's another one of those stories that we're trying to figure out. Did pollsters make enough corrections from 2016 to actually to get it correct, right? Because they underweighted on education in 2016. They missed some of the suburban vote in some of the other election cycles. I think there's a big question out there for pollsters in terms of how close are they going to get the result, right? Because right now they're saying that essentially 43 states, we have a pretty good idea of what's going to happen. It's those 7 battleground states where we think they're really close. If we don't see a close margin in some of those 7 battleground states, then I think pollsters are going to be asking, you know, what do we miss this cycle? What's the variable that we didn't weight properly on?
And who would have thought, you know, several months ago that President Biden wouldn't even be on the ticket, you know?
Right. And that was the really big shakeup, because we see it in poll after poll, at least among Democratic voters or likely Democratic voters, that their level of enthusiasm, their excitement, their optimism about the campaign fundamentally changed that last week in July, when it went from President Biden to Vice President Harris being at the top of the ticket. For the Democratic Party now, you know, I think the big question is, to what extent were they able to sustain that momentum or that excitement to all the way through Election Day, where they have turnout that was higher than what they expected back in the early part of the summer?
So former President Donald Trump, he's really needs suburban women this time around. He's also really been going after African-American men. He's really seen an opening there within going against the Harris campaign. Here, though, there have been 2 key issues, it seems, in all the ads that we've seen in the District 1 and 2, of course, the big races around here. Randy Feenstra out in the 4th District, he's pretty much a lock, it looks like. The Central Iowa race in the 3rd, that's going to be very close. The key issues, though, for the Democrats have been reproductive rights. Republicans, as you've mentioned, pushing immigration. Yeah,
those have been the 2 dominant issues throughout the campaign, is, you know, that the Republican Party is pushing this issue of immigration, talking about it in terms of national security. The Democratic Party is talking about reproductive rights, you know, the change in reproductive rights at the state level since the Dobbs decision overturned Roe v. Wade 2 years ago. And both parties are trying to use those issues to activate their core set of supporters. I mean, again, you know, we talk about presidential campaigns coming down to quote, mobilizing the base. Both sides are pushing really hard with those 2 issues to try to mobilize their base and activate voters, not only their regular voters, but voters who maybe vote in 1 or 2 of the last 4 presidential elections. Are those issues that activate emotions enough in those voters that get them out to the polls?
So let's talk, first of all, let's talk the 2nd District race. We have 2-term Republican Ashley Henson up against Democratic newcomer Sarah Corkery. And again, that is one really where Corkery is focused solely on reproductive rights. How close is that race? And unfortunately, as we tape this interview, the final Des Moines Register MediaCom poll has yet to come out. So a lot of you, if you see this program on Sunday morning, you'll be checking your register to see that poll. So as you see that race, it has not been that close in the last couple of times around.
Yeah, that race is, you know, if you think about the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd congressional districts in Iowa, that race is probably maybe the least competitive. That's not to say that it's not competitive. It's just maybe the least competitive of those 3, not counting the 4th district. And you know, you look at the fundraising numbers. You look at Congresswoman Henson's status as now running for re-election for a 2nd time for her 3rd term, right? And you know, typically the first re-election run's the most difficult. She's passed that. It has widespread name recognition, and the polls in that district suggest that there's a notable gap between the 2 candidates. We've seen that throughout the summer in the Des Moines Register polling. It narrowed a bit, but still a pretty sizable gap. and a bit of a gap there in terms of party registration, and the fact that Congresswoman Hinson won by a sizable margin in 2022 would suggest that this is going to be a difficult race for Sarah Corkery this time around.
And what about the first district? Remember, let's go back two times when Rita Hart and Dr. Marionette Miller Meeks, they were in a battle which was decided by 6 votes. Now the second, so Miller Meeks going again this time around, but 2 years ago in the rematch, or the first time that they matched, this is a rematch against Christina Bohannon. That was a over 20,000 point difference, or vote difference. So as we talked with Christina Bohannon in her interview, we've had all the candidates on this show, by the way, and you can check those out on kwwl.com. I just said to her, you have to change the minds of 10,000 people. That race looks to be closer, though, than anyone anticipated.
It does seem to be closer, and you look at fundraising. It's fairly tight in terms of fundraising. You have 2 candidates now with Christina Bohannon running again. She has more name recognition than she did the last time around, and so as you mentioned, you're seeing the Democratic Party really push hard on the issue of reproductive rights because they see that particular district as one. If there's an activation of a sizable number of Democratic-leaning voters, or maybe independents who lean Democratic. That race could narrow quite a bit, and I think that's what Democrats are banking on, is that the so-called nationalization of these House elections, where they get caught up in the national conversation. They're hoping that optimism, maybe that excitement from the summer, spreads down to that district, and that you see a pretty tight race at this point.
So we always have some good local races, but the one I think everyone's focusing on is the Senate District 38. So you have a Democratic incumbent in Eric Giddens against former Cedar Falls City Council member Dave Sires, the Republican candidate. And you had a chance to moderate a debate recently involving those two. They go head-to-head pretty good. Yeah.
They do. I mean, it's a very sharp contrast between Senator Giddens and former Council member Sires. And it's a really unique district. It's sort of a microcosm of the state of Iowa, in the sense that you have that urban area with Cedar Falls, but then you have very rural parts of several counties within the district. And so that rural-urban divide, you see that in the district, and then you see that in terms of the activity of the 2 candidates, who the voters are they're reaching out to, the expectations, the fundraising, all that plays into that. So it has become a pretty competitive race.
I know in Hudson, of course everybody knows I live in Hudson, so there was a gentleman walking through our neighborhood, and a lot of people aren't home during the day, but they were dropping off pamphlets in Dave Sires, trying to get support for him, and that's sometimes how you have to win in a race like that. You have to get out and go into the neighborhoods, door to door, person on person, see how that plays off for him, or will it pay off, I guess,
Well, and both candidates have talked about how many doors they've knocked on throughout this race over the last several months or a year or so. And you're right, when you think about mobilizing voters, that face-to-face, the personal contact has been shown to be the most effective. Now, it's time-consuming to do, but that's the most effective in terms of actually getting people to turn out to vote, whether it's early in-person voting, absentee, or on election day.
And I'm not saying that Eric Giddens hasn't been in the neighborhoods. He just wasn't in my neighborhood that I saw anyway. Or maybe I wasn't home that day. I didn't see the pamphlet dropped off like so many of the other candidates. Either drop it off at your home or send it in the mail.
Right.
One of the questions that I'd like to ask you, Chris, is what do you think about, this is the first time in many, many years where some of the major newspapers that always endorse candidates have decided we're not going to do that this year. And it's a reflection of what, do you think?
It's hard to know there's a lot of speculation about what that could be a reflection of. If that's the motivations of the editors of the papers, or what's going on there. The other part of this too is, from a political science perspective, it's hard to measure endorsements, because what you're trying to figure out is, did it persuade a voter, or did it mobilize a voter who was already leaning that particular way? I think when you think about some of these endorsements, they're likely things that happen that sort of reaffirm the way a voter feels about a particular person. So it may not persuade them, it gives them more a sense of security, or just reaffirms their pre-existing beliefs about a particular candidate, and they're more likely to follow what the newspaper had said, because they were already leaning that way. So I think the power of endorsements is something that's hard to figure out, but it's interesting to see this cycle, I guess, that these major newspapers are not going one way or the other.
Yeah, and of course, even at the Washington Post, several editors, I think, resigned in protest because the owner, Jeff Bezos, said they were not going to endorse this year. It's his paper. I always kind of felt that if we endorse somebody as a television station, it would taint our coverage. And I've always kind of felt that way about newspapers. As soon as you endorse someone with your newspaper, it kind of taints in a sometimes subtle and sometimes blatant way that who you're favoring. That just has never seemed right to me.
Yeah, it's an interesting balance. And again, it's hard to know why they are deciding this cycle where you see all these newspapers do it. If it was that maybe they had been thinking about it, but then once one major paper did it, they felt more comfortable in doing it. It's hard to know. I think whether it's a newspaper or the Harris campaign is talking about a lot of these Republican elected officials or former Republican elected officials who are endorsing her campaign. The effect of endorsements is something that's just really hard to measure.
Vice President Harris needs to get the vote of African American men, and some of the polls have shown that has gone a little bit the other way, which is really surprising because Democrats are always supported by African Americans.
Yeah, the gap in terms of the support for the Democratic candidate among African American voters has narrowed considerably since what we saw in 2008, 2012, and then even 2016 to 2020. And so, former President Obama has held rallies now for Vice President Harris, specifically talking to African American men, encouraging them to turn out to vote for Vice President Harris. And it's clear it's a key demographic because if you're talking about these 7 states and African American voters in some of those 7 states, and if it's down to 10, 20, 50,000 voters, that's where a state can swing, and that's where this presidential election can potentially swing. And so you're absolutely right. That gap that we normally see between the Democratic and Republican candidate among African American voters, particularly African American men, has narrowed considerably this cycle, and I think we've seen the Harris campaign react to that.
Yeah, and I think one of the key issues of that is the fact that it all reflects on the economy. How am I doing personally? How's my family doing? Yep. And a lot of African American families are taking that to heart. Really, what has been happening in the last 4 years? Am I better off? Can I be better off? Who should I go with? A lot of people are still undecided, but a lot of people have made up their mind, and they're not going to change no matter what happens between now and Election Day, right?
Yeah, and that's one of the bigger challenges for the Harris campaign this whole cycle has been that question of the right track, wrong track. Is the country on the right track or has it gotten off the wrong track? That has, been quite negative throughout the election cycle. The question of are you better off or worse off has also been negative. And so if you're an incumbent running it for re-election and you see those numbers as being particularly negative, whether it's the right track, wrong track, or better off, worse off, if those are negative, that spells trouble for an incumbent. Now, obviously for Vice President Harris, she's not necessarily the incumbent, but she's part of the ticket that was going to be the incumbent re-election campaign. And so that feeling of sort of economic security is also a big part of this campaign, and it's been a challenge since Vice President Harris took over in late July.
So his overall turnout on Election Day is very, very important, despite what we talked about, the millions and millions of people. A lot of you have already voted early. So, but bad weather can happen, things can happen on a day that might prevent someone from voting. So, like I have made my mind up, as I mentioned. You've already voted, so you know what you're doing. But how important is that Election Day turnout to just mobilize your final supporters that are on the fence?
Yeah, well, it's incredibly important. And I think, and I also think about it in terms of combination of what's happened with early voting so far. In previous election cycles, there was a considerable gap between if you look at the party registration of those early voters, right? It tended to skew Democratic. From the party registration numbers that we have so far, that gap has narrowed considerably. That is, that you see more Republicans using early in-person or absentee voting than they have in the past, and the gap between Democrats and Republicans doing that is down to just a couple of percentage points nationally for the states that we have that data or those data in, and then in Iowa it's also down to just a couple percentage points. So, I guess the question then is, what does that look like for Election Day? Because then typically there's a gap there favoring Republicans on Election Day turnout, that Republicans are more likely to vote on Election Day than Democrats. And do we see any sort of change in that because of the changes we've seen with early voting? I think that's one of the questions. And then all of this comes on the heels of the 2020 presidential election, which was done during a pandemic when many states automatically sent out requests for absentee, and so a lot of people were early voting in the 2020 presidential election. Do they go back to changing to Election Day voting? I think that's one of the big questions we need to have answered on Election night.
Okay, Dr. Larimer will be with us right here on the set for Election Night coverage. Looking forward to that, Chris, as always. Really appreciate that. We're going to wrap things up here on this week's edition of the Steele Report in just a moment. And as we wrap up this week's program, a reminder you can find all of our recent congressional candidate interviews on kwwo.com from our previous shows. We have Dr. Marionette Miller-Meeks, we have Christina Bohannon, Ashley Hinson, Sarah Corkery, and Jody Puffett. And be sure to join our election coverage Tuesday night. As always, thanks for watching. We'll see you back here next week.